He had no idea the woman he married, the quiet, selfless woman his mother called worthless and threw into the street like yesterday's trash, was the hidden heir to a $500 billion tech empire. But here is what made it worse. The very mistress he chose over her, the woman he was secretly coaching through boardroom doors and five-star dinners, had spent the last 8 months begging that same empire for a partnership deal, crawling through every corporate channel, rejected every single time, never once connecting the dots back to the woman sleeping in her rival's bed. And he, blind, arrogant, and drunk on a love that was never loyalty, chose the night of the most prestigious gala of the year to make it all public, in front of cameras, in front of industry titans, in front of the very people who already knew what he did not. Oh, he humiliated his wife at that gala, stripped her of her dignity in a room full of witnesses, then dropped to one knee and proposed to his mistress like it was a coronation. His mother had already done her part. Before the gala, she had gathered every belonging his wife owned, every dress, every document, every memory folded into fabric, and threw her belongings into the street like she was evicting a stranger. But nobody, not the mother, not the mistress, not the husband, knew what was already in motion, because the moment she walked out of that house and stood on that pavement, something had already been activated. Boardrooms in 3 continents were alerted, security teams were scrambled, and within hours a fleet of Bugattis and a private jet arrived to escort her, not away from her shame, but straight into her throne. What she did next didn't just leave him speechless. It left him begging at doors that were now permanently closed. It left him blacklisted from every boardroom, every partnership, every investor circle he had spent years building. So here is the question that should stop you from scrolling. If the woman you humiliated in public turned out to own the empire your mistress was begging to enter, what does that say about what you destroyed? And what does it say about the kind of power that stays quiet until it doesn't have to anymore? Dear viewers, this story is not just entertainment. It is a mirror. It will teach you that dignity never announces itself, that hidden value always surfaces, and that the people you underestimate are often the ones holding doors you cannot open without them. As you watch this story unfold, ask yourself, what would I have done differently? Drop your answers in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story speaks to you, subscribe now, because every week we bring you stories that don't just entertain, they transform. The morning it all began, Eleanor Voss was ironing her husband's shirt. Not because she had to, but because 12 years of marriage had taught her that the small, invisible acts of care were the only language Preston Voss ever received without argument. She pressed the collar flat, hung it on the door hook, and stood back, the way a woman stands back from something she has poured herself into for longer than she should have. Preston was already on his phone. He had been on his phone before his eyes were fully open, and Eleanor had long since stopped asking who he was talking to at 6 a.m. But she knew, the way a woman always knows, not from evidence, but from the particular quality of a man's silence when someone specific is on the other end. His name was Preston Voss, Regional Director of Voss Capital Ventures, a mid-tier investment firm that had built its reputation on Preston's relentless networking and his mother's inherited connections. He was the kind of man who walked into rooms and immediately recalibrated where the power was sitting. Handsome in the way that photographs well, charming in the way that only works until someone is paying close attention, and for 12 years, Eleanor had been paying very close attention. She had married him young, 23, fresh from a grief she had never fully explained to anyone. Her grandfather, Theodore Whitmore, had died 6 months before the wedding, and the version of Eleanor that walked down the aisle was already carrying something heavy and unspoken. Preston had mistaken her quietness for simplicity. He had never thought to ask what was underneath it. What was underneath it would have changed everything. 3 years before that morning, in a glass-paneled office on the 44th floor of a building that didn't carry a public sign, Eleanor had sat across from a man named Gerald Ashford, lead counsel for the Whitmore Legacy Trust. The room smelled of cedar and old money. Gerald had slid a document across the table with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something irreplaceable. "You are the sole designated heir to Whitmore Global Technologies," he had said. "Now, current valuation, $504 billion. The transition of control is yours to time, but until you activate it, Miss Whitmore, nothing moves and nothing is disclosed." Eleanor had looked at the document for a long time. Then she had looked out the window at the city below. All those people moving in straight lines, convinced they understood who held power and who did not. "I need more time," she had said quietly. Gerald had nodded. He had expected that. "The trust will wait. It has waited 70 years. It can wait a little longer." She had driven home that evening, walked into the kitchen, and made dinner. Preston had come home late. She hadn't asked from where. And they had eaten in the particular silence of two people sharing a table, but not a life. She had said nothing about the 44th floor, nothing about Gerald Ashford, nothing about the $504 billion that now, legally and irrevocably, belonged to her. Because her grandfather had taught her something that Preston Voss, with all his networking and all his charm, had never learned. The most dangerous person in any room is the one nobody is watching. But back to that morning. Preston finished his call, knotted his tie in the mirror, and told Eleanor, without turning to face her, that his mother would be stopping by in the afternoon to collect a few things. Eleanor had paused. The iron was still warm in her hand. She understood, with the precision of a woman who had been bracing for something for longer than she admitted, exactly what collect a few things meant. It meant Diane Voss had already decided, and when Diane Voss decided something, Preston did not resist. He never had. Diane arrived at 2 o'clock in a black SUV with 2 hired men and the expression of someone completing an overdue errand. She walked through Eleanor's home, the home Eleanor had decorated, maintained, and quietly loved. And she directed those 2 men with the brisk efficiency of a woman who felt absolutely no conflict about what she was doing. By 3:15, Eleanor's clothing was in bags on the pavement. Her books, her grandmother's photograph, the small ceramic dish she kept her rings in, all of it, on the street. Diane dusted her hands, looked at Eleanor standing on the front step, and said only 4 words. "Preston has moved on." Eleanor looked at her belongings scattered across the pavement. Then she looked at Diane. And she did something that unsettled Diane more than any argument could have. She smiled, not bitterly, not desperately, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who had just been handed the exact permission she had been waiting 12 years to receive. She pulled out her phone, and she made one call. What did that one phone call set in motion? And why had Eleanor been waiting? Not for Preston to change, but for this exact moment. The Harrington Grand Gala was not the kind of event you attended. It was the kind of event you were summoned to, held every year in the mirrored ballroom of the Harrington Tower, 40 stories above the city, where the lights below looked like scattered diamonds and the air itself seemed to carry the weight of old money and older secrets. It was the singular gathering where industry titans, legacy families, and carefully vetted new money all occupied the same gilded room and pretended they were equals. Preston Voss had spent 3 years engineering an invitation. Tonight he had arrived with Vanessa Holt on his arm. Vanessa was everything Preston had convinced himself Eleanor was not. Polished where Eleanor was understated. Vocal where Eleanor was measured. She wore ambition like a second skin. And Preston, he who had always confused loudness for strength, had mistaken her performance for substance. She was the founder of Holt Innovations, a mid-sized tech startup that had burned through 2 funding rounds and was now quietly hemorrhaging capital behind a very expensive public-facing facade. What Preston did not know, what Vanessa had never told him, because telling him would have required admitting failure, was that Holt Innovations had spent the last 8 months submitting partnership proposals to Whitmore Global Technologies. 8 months of pitch decks, 8 months of follow-up calls that went to voicemail, 8 months of rejections so politely worded they almost disguised the finality inside them. Vanessa had never connected the name Whitmore to the quiet woman Preston had been married to for 12 years. Why would she? And Eleanor never spoke about it. Preston certainly didn't know. And Whitmore Global Technologies, by design of the Legacy Trust, carried no public photograph of its incoming heir. None. So Vanessa had spent 8 months begging the empire that belonged to the woman whose husband she was stealing. But tonight, none of that was on her mind. Tonight, she was focused entirely on what Preston had promised her was coming. Eleanor had arrived at the gala alone. She had received her invitation 3 weeks earlier. Not from Preston, but directly from the Harrington Foundation, who maintained a standing invitation for members of the Whitmore legacy family, a detail that had existed quietly in their records for 40 years. She had dressed simply. Navy. No excess. The kind of woman who understood that the less you announce yourself, the more carefully a room full of powerful people begins to watch you. She had taken her seat at table 9, slightly removed from the main floor, near the eastern window, and she had watched. She had watched Preston work the room with Vanessa, the way he always worked rooms. The handshake that lasted 1 second too long. The laugh deployed at precise intervals. The careful management of who saw him with whom. She had watched his mother, Diane, stationed near the bar like a general overseeing a campaign she had personally designed. And she had watched the 3 people at table 2. 2 men and a woman, gray suits, no name tags, the particular stillness of people who did not need to network because everyone already knew who they were. Gerald Ashford was one of them. He had caught Eleanor's eye the moment she sat down, and he had given her the smallest nod. She had nodded back. Preston moved to the microphone at 9:47. The room quieted with the speed of a crowd that senses theater. He smiled, that photograph-ready smile, and he began to speak about gratitude, about growth, about the woman who had stood beside him through everything. Eleanor felt the room shift its attention toward her. She kept her expression perfectly still, but Preston was not looking at her. He was looking at Vanessa. And before Eleanor could fully process what was unfolding, Preston had crossed the floor, taken her hand, not warmly, but with the performative grip of a man building a scene, and turned to face the room. "There are moments," he said into the microphone, voice smooth and rehearsed, "when a man realizes he has been living below his potential, in his career, in his choices," he paused deliberately, "and in his marriage." The room went absolutely silent. Eleanor felt 500 pairs of eyes land on her simultaneously. She did not flinch. She did not look down, but she felt it. The precise, surgical humiliation of being made an example in a room full of witnesses, by the man who had promised before God and everyone to protect her. Preston dropped her hand. He stepped back. And then he crossed to Vanessa Holt, reached into his jacket and lowered himself onto one knee. The gasps came in a wave, but Eleanor was not watching Preston anymore. She was watching table 2. Gerald Ashford had already opened his phone, and somewhere across the city, in a private garage that housed 12 automobiles, each one a Bugatti, each one black, each one already running, a convoy was being prepared. When not summoned by Eleanor, sent for her, because Gerald Ashford had been watching that microphone the moment Preston reached for it, and the trust had a protocol for exactly this moment, the moment the heir was publicly humiliated, publicly discarded, and therefore publicly free. The protocol had one instruction: escort her home, her real home. But here is what nobody in that ballroom understood yet. Not Preston, not Vanessa, not even Diane, who stood near the bar with satisfaction spreading across her face like a slow stain. The 3 people at table 2 were not just attorneys. They were board members of Whitmore Global Technologies. And every single person in that room who mattered. Every titan, every legacy name, every quietly powerful face Eleanor had been watching all evening, already knew exactly who Eleanor Voss was. And they had known before the gala started. They had come tonight specifically to watch what Preston would do. And now they had their answer. What does a room full of powerful people do when they watch a man destroy himself in real time without ever realizing that is what he is doing? And what happens when Vanessa Holt discovers that the partnership she has been begging for, the one rejection after rejection couldn't kill her hope for, was never going to be decided by a board? It was always going to be decided by Eleanor. Eleanor did not rush. That was the first thing everyone remembered afterward. Not the Bugattis, not the jet, not the way the ballroom lights caught the convoy as it pulled up to the Harrington Tower's main entrance, like a coordinated statement from the universe itself. What they remembered first was that Eleanor Voss did not rush. She rose from table 9 with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who had been patient for 12 years and had decided, in the space of a single evening, that patience had served its full purpose. She smoothed the front of her navy dress. She retrieved her clutch from the back of her chair. And then she walked, not toward the exit, but toward the center of the room, toward Preston. The murmurs had already started. The proposal had landed like a stone in still water. Ellen and the ripples were moving fast through 500 people who were now recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the evening. Vanessa was still holding Preston's hand, the ring catching light on her finger, her smile stretched to its maximum performance. Preston was accepting congratulations from the nearest cluster of guests with the relief of a man who had just completed something he had been afraid to do. He did not see Eleanor approaching until she was 4 feet away. And then he saw her, and something in his expression shifted. Not guilt, not yet, but the particular discomfort of a man who had not accounted for his discarded wife remaining in the room after being discarded. Eleanor stopped in front of him. She looked at him for a long moment. The way you look at something you once loved and are now studying for the last time, committing it to memory not out of longing, but out of completion. Then she looked at Vanessa, and then quietly, so that only the three of them could hear it, she said, "Congratulations, Vanessa. I genuinely hope the partnership you've been searching for finds you." Vanessa's smile flickered, just slightly. Something about the word partnership, the specific, loaded weight Eleanor placed on it, moved through Vanessa like a cold current she couldn't identify or explain. Eleanor turned and walked toward the exit. She pushed through the Harrington Tower's main doors at 10:22 and stopped. The convoy was already there. 12 Bugatti Chiron Profile automobiles, each one obsidian black, each one running, each one positioned with the geometric precision of a military escort. They lined the full length of the tower's entrance, and beyond them, visible at the end of the cleared boulevard, were the Harrington's private airstrip connected to the city's executive terminal. The running lights of a private jet blinked slowly in the dark, like a patient, breathing thing. A man in a charcoal suit stepped forward from the lead vehicle. Eleanor recognized him immediately. His name was Clifton Reeves, head of security for Whitmore Global Technologies, a man her grandfather had hired 30 years ago and who had been quietly watching over Eleanor from a distance for the last decade without her ever asking him to. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "not Mrs. Voss, Miss Whitmore." The name she had been born with, the name the trust carried, the name that unlocked everything. "The board is assembled. They are ready when you are." Eleanor looked at the convoy, then at the jet, then back at Clifton. And here is where the story pivots, because what Eleanor did in that moment was not what anyone watching from the tower's glass entrance expected. She did not get in immediately. She turned back toward the building, and she stood there, facing those glass doors, for exactly 45 seconds. Not from hesitation, not from doubt, but because Eleanor Whitmore was the kind of woman who closed doors properly before she walked through new ones. Inside, through the glass, she could see the ballroom from a distance. She could see Preston, still working the room, still performing, already pivoting from the spectacle of the proposal back to networking, because that was who Preston Voss had always been. A man who moved on before the previous moment had finished breathing. She could see Diane near the bar, satisfaction still arranged across her face. She could see Vanessa, but Vanessa was no longer smiling. Vanessa was standing very still, phone in hand, staring at something on her screen with an expression that Eleanor, even from this distance, recognized immediately. Vanessa had just received an email. 4 days earlier, Eleanor had sat in Gerald Ashford's office on the 44th floor and made 3 decisions. The first decision was to attend the gala, and the second decision was to authorize Gerald to prepare a formal communication to every active partnership applicant currently on the Whitmore Global Technologies waitlist. A communication to go out the moment Eleanor stepped outside the Harrington Tower's main doors. Not before, the moment after. The third decision was the one that would take Preston Voss's entire professional world apart at the seams. Quietly, completely, and without a single raised voice, She had signed that authorization with the same calm she brought to ironing his shirts. The email Vanessa was reading, the one draining the color from her face in real time, in the middle of a ballroom where she was still technically celebrating her engagement, was a formal notice from Whitmore Global Technologies. It informed her that Holt Innovation's partnership application had been reviewed at the highest level of the organization and permanently closed. Not rejected, closed. There was a legal distinction, and the email explained it precisely. Closed meant no reapplication, no appeal, no future consideration under any restructured entity or rebranded submission. The door was not locked. The door had been removed entirely. The email was signed. Eleanor Whitmore, Acting Chair, Whitmore Global Technologies. Not Eleanor Voss. Eleanor Whitmore. Vanessa read the name 3 times, and on the 3rd time, the full architecture of what she had never understood came down on her like a controlled demolition. Silent, total, and perfectly timed. The woman she had replaced was the woman who owned the empire she had spent 8 months begging to enter. Eleanor turned away from the glass doors. She looked at Clifton Reeves. She looked at the 12 black Bugattis and the waiting jet, and the city spread out behind them like a world that had been rearranged while everyone else was looking the other direction. And then Eleanor Whitmore, hidden heir to a $500 billion tech empire, the woman thrown into the street that same afternoon, the woman humiliated at a gala in front of 500 witnesses, walked to the lead vehicle, allowed Clifton to open the door, and stepped inside. The convoy moved immediately, smooth, silent, inevitable, like power that had never needed to announce itself. But what happened when Preston Voss walked out of the Harrington Tower 20 minutes later and found not a single parking attendant willing to meet his eyes? And what did the board of Whitmore Global Technologies place in front of Eleanor the moment she stepped off that jet? A document that would not just change her life, but end Preston's professional world before sunrise? The jet landed at 4:17 in the morning. Not at a commercial terminal. Not at any airstrip Preston Voss had ever been invited to use. It landed at Whitmore Global Technologies' private aviation facility, a compound Eleanor had never visited in person, but had seen in photographs her grandfather kept in a leather-bound album he called The Inheritance You Will Grow Into. She had been 9 years old the first time she turned those pages. She had run her finger along the photograph of the airstrip and asked him what it meant to own something that large. He had looked at her with the particular patience of a man who understood that some answers were only useful when the person asking them was ready to carry the weight. It means, Theodore Whitmore had said slowly, that one day, and when everything around you tries to make you feel small, you will have somewhere to land. Eleanor stepped off the jet and onto the tarmac. The air was cool and carried the particular stillness of 4 in the morning, the hour when the world has not yet begun performing itself again. A row of lights guided her path toward the main facility. Clifton Reeves walked 2 steps behind her, as he always had, as she was only now allowing herself to fully register. Gerald Ashford was waiting at the entrance. Beside him stood 5 people, the full active board of Whitmore Global Technologies, in the particular formation of people who have been waiting a long time and are choosing not to make that visible. Eleanor recognized each face from the files Gerald had quietly sent her over the years. She had studied them the way she studied everything, thoroughly, privately, without announcing that she had done so. The board's senior director, a measured woman named Catherine Osei, stepped forward first. "Miss Whitmore," Catherine said, "welcome home." Eleanor looked at her, and for the first time since that morning, since the iron, since Diane's SUV, since the microphone and the ring and the pavement and the convoy, Eleanor felt something unlock in her chest. Not relief exactly. Something older than relief. Something that felt like the completion of a sentence that had been suspended mid-breath for 12 years. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. "Let's get to work." The boardroom was on the facility's upper level, glass on 3 sides, with the city's pre-dawn skyline visible in every direction, like a map of everything that was now hers to navigate. Gerald placed a document in front of her the moment she sat down. It was the formal activation package for the Whitmore Legacy Trust, 63 pages that would transfer full operational control of Whitmore Global Technologies to Eleanor effective upon her signature. Alongside it sat a secondary document. Eleanor looked at it for a long moment before picking it up. It was a blacklist authorization. Gerald spoke carefully. The trust has provisions for the protection of the incoming chair's professional ecosystem. Any individual or entity deemed to present a conflict of interest, reputational risk, or direct threat to the chair's standing can be formally flagged across our entire partner network, which currently includes 47 of the top 50 global investment institutions. Eleanor read the document. Then she set it down. "Who is already on it?" she asked. Gerald exchanged a brief look with Catherine. "Holt Innovations was closed last night, per your authorization. That closure has already been registered across the network. Any institution carrying our partner flag will see the notation." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And Preston Voss?" The room was very quiet. "That decision," Gerald said, "belongs entirely to you." Flashback. 11 years earlier, Preston had stood in the kitchen of their first apartment. A small, honest place with secondhand furniture and a window that stuck, and told Eleanor something she had never forgotten. They had just received a rejection letter from a venture fund he had applied to. He had been angry. The particular hot anger of someone who believes their talent is being deliberately overlooked. He had crumpled the letter, and then he had looked at Eleanor, who was sitting quietly at the table, and said, "People like us have to fight for everything. Nobody's going to hand us anything. Nobody." She had said nothing, but she had thought, with a careful, private clarity that was her most consistent characteristic, that he was half right. Nobody was going to hand him anything, but that was not her situation, and it never had been. She had chosen in that moment and in every moment that followed to stay quiet. Not from weakness, but because she had understood, even then, that Preston's hunger was not her responsibility to satisfy, and his blindness was not her obligation to correct. She had simply waited. Back in the boardroom, Eleanor picked up the pen. She signed the activation package first, all 63 pages, calmly, completely. With the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything she did. When she finished, Catherine Ossie began the formal process of notifying the network. 47 institutions receiving simultaneous confirmation that Eleanor Whitmore had assumed full operational control of Whitmore Global Technologies, effective immediately. The financial press would have the story before sunrise. Then Eleanor looked at the blacklist authorization. She held the pen over it for a long moment. And here is where the story delivers its most important truth, the one that separates Eleanor Whitmore from every lesser version of this moment. She did not sign it. Not for Preston, not for Vanessa, not even for Diane. She set the pen down. She looked at Gerald. "I won't need that," she said. Gerald tilted his head slightly. "The provisions exist specifically. I know what they exist for," Eleanor said, "but a blacklist requires me to keep thinking about them, and I am done thinking about them." She folded her hands on the table. "What I need," she continued, "is for you to release our full partner network communication, announcing the transition of leadership. I need our revised partnership framework published by 6 a.m., and I need a press briefing scheduled for 9. She paused. "Oh, Preston Voss and Holt Innovations will not need to be blacklisted, Gerald, because by 9 o'clock this morning, every institution in our network will know exactly who I am, and they will draw their own conclusions about the people who threw me into the street." She was right. By 6 a.m., the financial press had picked up the Whitmore leadership transition. By 7, 3 major institutions had quietly suspended their exploratory conversations with Voss Capital Ventures, pending clarification of relational conflicts. By 8, Preston's phone had stopped receiving return calls. Not because anyone had been told to ignore him, but because 47 institutions with Whitmore partner flags had done exactly what Eleanor predicted. They had drawn their own conclusions. Preston Voss spent that morning calling every contact he had built over 15 years of networking. But the rooms he had spent years carefully entering were closing, not with dramatic declarations, not with confrontation, but with the polite, immovable silence of people who had already made a quiet decision. He called Eleanor at 8:43. She did not answer. He called again at 8:51 and 9:04, and 9:17, which was precisely the moment Eleanor walked to a podium in Whitmore Global Technologies press facility and introduced herself to the world. Not as Eleanor Voss, as Eleanor Whitmore. Vanessa Holt filed for voluntary dissolution of Holt Innovations 11 days later. The press attributed it to funding pressures. Those who knew the full story understood it was something simpler: the complete and permanent closure of every door that might have saved it. Diane Voss called Eleanor once. Eleanor's assistant took the message. Eleanor never returned it. And Preston, the man who had stood at a microphone in a gilded ballroom and told 500 people he had been living below his potential, spent the following months discovering, with the particular devastation of someone who had always mistaken access for ownership, that every door he had ever walked through had been held open by the quiet woman he had thrown away. He had begged, first the institutions, then mutual contacts. Then, in a letter Eleanor's legal team received and filed without response, Preston himself. But Eleanor was not in the business of revenge. She was in the business of Whitmore, and Whitmore was worth $500 billion. Every cent of it built on the foundational principle her grandfather had whispered to a 9-year-old girl turning pages in a leather album. The most dangerous person in any room is the one nobody is watching. Eleanor had spent 12 years being nobody, but nobody, it turned out, had been more than enough. The moral of the story: this story teaches us 4 things that no amount of money can buy and no act of arrogance can destroy. First, hidden value is still value. Eleanor's worth did not begin the night the convoy arrived. It existed the entire time. The people who dismissed her did not diminish her. They only diminished themselves. Second, patience is not weakness. Every quiet year Eleanor spent in that marriage was not wasted. It was strategic. She waited not because she had no options, but because she understood that timing is the difference between impact and noise. Third, and the people you underestimate are writing the ending. Preston spent 12 years looking past Eleanor, but Eleanor spent 12 years paying attention. Attention, in the end, is the most powerful currency in any room. Fourth, real power never needs revenge. Eleanor did not sign the blacklist. She did not confront Preston at the podium. She did not call Diane back. She simply stepped into her identity and let the weight of it do what weight naturally does. Dear viewers, you just watched a woman who was thrown into the street become the most powerful person in the room, not by fighting back, but by finally stepping forward. This story is your reminder that what people see in you does not determine what you are worth. The moment you stop shrinking to fit someone else's version of you is the moment everything changes. Now I want to hear from you. Drop in the comments the lesson that hit you hardest and tell me, what would you have done differently if you were Eleanor? If this story moved you, educated you, or stayed with you, subscribe right now, because this is only the beginning.